based on the available medical evidence, which I'm sure we'll go through and which was relatively scanty, it is entirely impossible to determine whether this cancer was a primary lung cancer.
So before we go further into the details, did Mr. Delancy have cancer?
Yes.
Was the cancer he had the cause of his death?
More likely than not, yes.
So what do you mean when you say impossible to determine whether it was a primary lung cancer? What do you mean by that?
Sure. A cancer is defined in two ways: by what it looks like under the microscope, what kind of biological cancer it was. And we have that information here. It was a poorly differentiated cancer, probably an adenocarcinoma, which we can talk about later. But the second thing is anatomically, where did the cancer begin? We know where it went to. It went to a lymph node, and it went to the brain. And it may have gone to other places, but we don't know where it came from. We have no evidence of where this cancer originated.
So based on the medical evidence, in this case, are you able to determine where Mr. Delancy's cancer first started in his body?
No.
So when you're describing the team, I think you said the pathologist is the center and snaps the ball. Is that how you said it?
Correct.
Okay, so let's talk about the pathology first. Did you review the pathology records from November of 1995 for Mr. Delancy?
Yes.
Okay. And can you give a 30,000-foot view of what pathology is and what role it plays in your work as an oncologist?
Sure. Pathology means that someone, often a surgeon, but sometimes a pathologist, takes a needle or a scalpel, makes an incision or puts a needle into a mass, takes out some of those cells, puts them on a glass slide. That slide is then stained in various ways so the cells have different colors. Then it's taken to a series of microscopes where the pathologist looks under the microscope and can identify what they see. A cancer cell looks very different than a normal cell. And so they can make a diagnosis that a cell is malignant pretty easily. It's harder sometimes to tell what kind of cancer it is because there are different types of cancers based on all the different organs it can originate in. So their job is to try to pin down what kind of cancer it is and then tell me that information so I can figure out where it began.
So can we have the report of the doctor question, please? So what's the first procedure that was done with Mr. Delancy in terms of trying to get a pathological sample transfer?
The first samples came on a bronchoscopy.
Can you explain just broadly what that is?
Bronchoscopy is a procedure where someone is sedated and then a tube is placed in their mouth and down into the trachea and into the bronchus, or the main windpipe. And you get it down as far as you can. You try to go into the different lobes of the lung if you can. And you take samples. And you take samples in several different ways. One is to use a pair of scissors, a small one, and snip off of anything you see. Secondly, you use a little tiny brush to brush off the cells, and hopefully you can collect cancer cells that way. Thirdly, you take a syringe with saline, which is salt water, squirt it in there, and hopefully you wash some of these cancer cells out, collect that fluid, and then look at that under the microscope.
Okay, so the first one we have, I think, is that brushing procedure you just talked about.
Correct.
There's a laser pointer in front of you. I think it's the red button. If there's anything you'd like to point to, and Mr. Farrell can highlight anything.
Sure. So it says here, bronchial brushings, cytology. So that's what I mentioned about a brushing is actually taking this brush and scraping along the inside of the bronchus and hoping you get some cells out. The word cytology is a Latin word for cell. So they're not looking at a piece of tissue. They're just looking at single cells. That's what a cytology specimen is. So that was what they obtained. This was the clinical information they were given.
So LUL mass, what is that refer to?
Left upper lobe.
And what does that reference to a left upper lobe mass mean in this context?
Well, there's two different pieces here. This is the statement of what was obtained and given to the pathologist. And this is history that was given to the pathologist saying, this is why we're doing this, because we think this exists. We want this to help us figure out what that might be.
Does a reference to LUL mass mean that Mr. Delancy had a cancer in his lung?
No, in fact, you'll see the word cancer doesn't appear here because, again, cancer is dependent on the pathologist. That hasn't been done yet.
So then they do the test, and what was the result?
Well, the key word is negative. So that's the bottom line. There were no atypical or malignant cells. That's what you're looking for to make a diagnosis of cancer. So this was essentially negative. There's no evidence of cancer.
And how does that inform your opinions that you stated to the jury about an inability to determine Mr. Delancy's primary site of cancer?
We're still in the dark. At this point in time, there's no cancer, period. There's no cancer cells found from anywhere, so this gentleman did not have a cancer diagnosis on this date.
Can you pull up the washing? I think you described the saline solution washing procedure. So
Right.
did they do that for Mr.
Yeah.
Delancy?
Essentially the same thing. Instead of saying bronchial brushing, it now says bronchial washing, but it's the same idea, just using saline instead of a brush. And again, the same history they were given, and this is what they're hoping to make a diagnosis from.
And according to the results of this washing procedure, did the pathologist find any cancer in the cells taken from Mr. Delancy's airway?
Yeah, again, we have the same thing, negative. So once again, a diagnosis of cancer has not yet been made.
And so you've talked about the brushings and the washings. Is there any other pathological tests done on any cells from Mr. Delancy's lung?
No. However, in a bronchoscopy, if something was seen, it would also have been biopsied. And the fact that there's no biopsy implies, because we don't have the report, but it implies that nothing was seen either. So they visually looked inside his lung and all these bronchus areas and did not see any cancer.
So I want to make sure I follow up on what you just said. When you're saying another procedure could have been a biopsy, could you explain to the jury what you mean by that?
Right. As I said, there are three things you want to do when you go into someone's bronchus. You want to look visually, and if you see a mass, you get a piece of it. That's a biopsy. That's tissue. If you don't see anything, you kind of shoot blindly with the brushings or the washings. So they obviously were able to do the brushings and washings. They were both negative, which confirms, again, the fact that they saw nothing because there was no biopsy taken. You can't biopsy something blindly. That's too dangerous.